The wind screamed like something alive, something furious, tearing across the Wyoming plains with a violence that turned snow into knives. Etta Lockhart pressed her gloved hand against the frozen bark of a lodgepole pine and forced her eyes open against the white blindness of the storm. Somewhere beneath 3 feet of fresh powder, beneath the ice that had already begun to seal the world shut, she had found a boot. Not just any boot. A deputy's boot, the kind with the reinforced heel that the sheriff's office ordered special from Cheyenne. She had seen Marcus Calloway wear its twin not 4 days before, striding into her cabin with that infuriating confidence of his, warning her that trapping season was closing early because of the weather reports coming down the wire from the territorial office. Now his boot was all that showed above the snow, and the rest of him was buried like a corpse waiting for spring thaw to give up its secrets. "No," she said aloud, her voice swallowed instantly by the howling wind. "No, you do not get to die on me, Marcus Calloway." Her hands, though numb at the fingertips despite the rabbit fur lining of her gloves, moved with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had survived 11 winters alone in the high country. She dropped to her knees, ignoring the cold that bit through her wool trousers, and began to dig with the flat of her hand axe, careful strokes, the way she had taught herself to excavate a marten from a snow den without crushing the animal beneath. The snow gave way in chunks. A calf. A knee. The dark blue wool of a sheriff's office coat, stiff with ice. "Come on," she whispered, and dug faster now, her breath coming in ragged clouds that froze on her scarf. "Come on, you stubborn fool. You are not allowed to leave me alone out here with your ghost." When she finally cleared his face, her heart seized in her chest like a trap snapping shut. His lips had gone the color of a bruised plum. His eyelashes were fused together with frost, delicate as spun glass, and for one terrible moment she was certain she had dug up a dead man. Then she saw it, the faintest fog of breath, no bigger than a whisper, rising from his parted lips into the screaming white air. Alive. Barely, but alive. "Do not you dare," she said, and grabbed the collar of his coat with both hands, hauling with every ounce of strength her lean, hard-won muscles possessed. "Do not you dare die on me now, Marcus. Not after everything. Not after what you accused me of." The wind answered with a shriek that could have been laughter or could have been the mountain itself mocking her audacity to fight against a blizzard for the life of a man who, only 3 days earlier, had stood in her doorway and called her a liar to her face. That was how it began, this frozen, furious rescue in the heart of a Wyoming blizzard in the winter of 1887. But to understand how Etta Lockhart came to be kneeling in the snow, fighting death itself for the man who had wronged her, you would need to go back to the beginning, back before the accusations, before the betrayal, back to the first time Marcus Calloway ever set eyes on the trapper woman of Bitter Creek Valley and mistook her, foolishly, for something less than she was. The town of Larkspur Hollow sat nestled in a fold of the Wind River foothills, a scattering of clapboard buildings and false-fronted stores that had sprung up around a silver strike some 6 years before Etta ever arrived. By the time she made her home in the valley beyond it, the silver had mostly played out, and the town had settled into the quieter, harder business of cattle and timber, and the fur trade that fed men like her. She had come west from Missouri at 19, following a father who chased fortune the way other men chased whiskey, and when consumption took him in a rented room above the Larkspur Mercantile, she had been left with nothing but his rifle, his traps, and a fierce, unbending determination not to be pitied by anyone in that town. She was 26 now, 7 years into a life that had taught her every secret the mountains kept. She knew which creeks froze solid enough to cross, and which ones hid currents that would pull a person under even in January. She knew how to read a beaver's dam for the health of its lodge, how to set a trap that would kill quick and clean instead of leaving an animal to suffer, how to skin and stretch and cure a pelt so fine that the buyers in Cheyenne paid her prices that made the men in town grind their teeth with envy and something uglier than envy. She lived alone in a cabin she had built herself, log by log in the shadow of Bitter Creek, 3 miles from the nearest neighbor and 4 from the edge of town, and she preferred it that way. People in Larkspur Hollow had opinions about a woman living alone in the wilderness, trapping and trading like a man, wearing trousers instead of skirts when the work demanded it, and Etta had long since stopped caring what those opinions were. Marcus Calloway had been the sheriff's deputy in Larkspur Hollow for going on 3 years when he first rode out to her cabin on official business. And even now, thinking back on it, Etta could recall the particular quality of his arrogance the way one remembers the sting of a burn. It was late autumn. The aspens turned gold and dropping their leaves in drifts across the trail, when he came pounding up to her door on a big bay gelding, his badge catching the afternoon light, his jaw set in the manner of a man who believed his authority was self-evident and required no courtesy to back it. "Miss Lockhart," he had said, not dismounting, looking down at her from the height of his saddle as though that height conferred some moral advantage. "There's been complaints about traps set too close to the Whitfield property line. Man's boy nearly lost a foot to one of your leg-hold traps last week." Etta had stood in her doorway with a skinning knife still in her hand, having been in the middle of dressing a fox when he interrupted her, and she had looked at him with the particular flatness she reserved for men who assumed guilt before they asked a single honest question. "Deputy Calloway," she had said, "I have not set a trap within a half-mile of the Whitfield property in going on 2 years, on account of old Whitfield himself asking me not to after his dog got caught in one that was not even mine. If his boy was hurt, it was more likely one of Cyrus Bell's traps, seeing as Bell traps sloppy and does not check his lines but once a week." Marcus had narrowed his eyes at her, clearly unaccustomed to being contradicted, especially by a woman standing in a doorway with blood on her hands from honest work. "That is a serious accusation to level against another trapper," he had said. "It is not an accusation," Etta had replied. "It is a fact, and if you rode out here on the strength of a complaint without checking whose traps were actually involved, then you have wasted your afternoon and mine both." He had stared at her for a long moment, and something had shifted behind his eyes, something that was not quite respect but was perhaps the beginning of the recognition that this woman was not going to be cowed by a badge and a stern voice. He had touched the brim of his hat, muttered something about following up with Bell, and ridden off without another word. That had been their first meeting, and Etta had thought little of it beyond a mild, simmering irritation. She had not expected to see much of Deputy Marcus Calloway after that, given how thoroughly she avoided the town and its politics. But Larkspur Hollow was a small place, and the mountains around it smaller still in the way they funneled people together whether they wished it or not. Over the following 2 years, their paths crossed with increasing and increasingly complicated frequency. He came to her when a rabid wolf was reported near the schoolhouse, because everyone in town knew that Etta Lockhart could track and dispatch a dangerous animal faster and more reliably than any of the men who fancied themselves hunters. He came to her when a trapper from Montana went missing in a snowstorm 2 winters back, because she alone knew the old logging trails well enough to search them safely. Each time he arrived with that same set jaw, that same wary formality, as though he resented needing her help even as he sought it. And each time, Etta found herself noticing things about him she wished she had not. The way his voice gentled when he spoke to frightened children during the wolf scare. The steadiness of his hands when he helped her splint a trapper's broken leg in the snow, following her instructions without argument, without the wounded male pride she had come to expect from men asked to take orders from a woman. The way he looked at the mountain sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, with an expression of aching loneliness that mirrored something she recognized in her own chest, but rarely allowed herself to examine. She learned in pieces, gathered from town gossip and the occasional unguarded remark, that Marcus Calloway had come to Wyoming from Texas after the war between the cattle barons and the smaller ranchers had turned bloody and personal. After his own father had been shot dead in a dispute over grazing rights that Marcus still would not speak of directly. He had taken the deputy position in Larkspur Hollow partly because Sheriff Wade Harmon was an old friend of his father's, and partly, Etta suspected, because a small mountain town offered him the chance to enforce law and order in a way that might, in some private accounting he kept with himself, make up for the lawlessness that had taken his father's life. He was, in short, a man carrying his own dark past, his own particular grief dressed up as duty, and Etta understood that kind of grief well enough to recognize it in another person, even if she had no intention of doing anything so foolish as caring about it. Then came the winter of 1887, a winter that the old-timers in Larkspur Hollow would speak of for decades afterward as the hardest anyone could remember, and everything between Etta Lockhart and Marcus Calloway changed with a suddenness that neither of them saw coming. It began, as these things often did in that country, with a theft. In early January, someone broke into the Larkspur Hollow assay office and made off with a strongbox containing nearly $4,000 in silver certificates and coin, money that belonged to a dozen small claim holders who had pooled their season's earnings for safekeeping until the spring shipment to Cheyenne. Sheriff Harmon, laid low with a bout of pneumonia that would eventually take him to his bed for the rest of that terrible winter, deputized Marcus with full authority to investigate and recover the stolen money, and Marcus threw himself into the task with the singular, unforgiving intensity of a man who needed, desperately, to prove something. Etta had nothing to do with any of it, or so she believed, until the afternoon Marcus rode out to her cabin for the third time in her memory, this time with an expression on his face that she had never seen him wear before, something cold and closed, and utterly without the wariness that had always, at least, suggested he was willing to be wrong. "I need to search your cabin," he had said, dismounting this time, standing square in front of her door with his hand resting near his revolver in a way that made her blood go hot with fury. "On what grounds," she had demanded, "do you believe you have any business searching my home? Cyrus Bell says he saw you in town the night of the robbery, near the assay office, later than you claimed to be there when I spoke to you before." "I was in town to trade 3 fox pelts and a bundle of mink at the mercantile," Etta had said, forcing her voice into a calm she did not feel. "I left before dark. Anyone who says otherwise is either mistaken or lying." "Bell is not lying," Marcus had said, and something in the flatness of his voice told her that he had already decided, already convicted her in his mind before he ever rode out to confront her, and that realization had struck her like a physical blow. "You believe him," she had said slowly, "over me." "I believe evidence," Marcus had replied, "and right now the evidence points toward you having a reason to need money and an opportunity to take it." "I have never needed anyone's money in my life," Etta had said, her voice rising now despite her best efforts to control it. "I have built everything I own with my own 2 hands, Marcus Calloway, and I will not stand here and be called a thief by a man who has known me for 2 years and apparently learned nothing about my character in all that time." "I am not calling you anything," Marcus had said. "I am doing my job." "Your job," Etta had spat, "is supposed to include the good sense to know the difference between a lying drunk like Cyrus Bell and a woman who has never once given this town a reason to doubt her word." He had searched her cabin anyway, methodically, coldly, while she stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and her jaw clenched so tight it ached for days afterward, and he had found nothing, because there was nothing to find, and when he left, he had not apologized. He had simply mounted his horse and ridden away without a backward glance, leaving Etta standing in her own doorway feeling more exposed and more furious than she had felt since the day her father died and left her entirely alone in the world. That was the wrong, the betrayal, the accusation that sat between them like a wound that would not close, and it was still sitting there, raw and unresolved, 3 days before the blizzard came down out of the Wind River Range and swallowed Marcus Calloway whole. The days following the search had passed in a haze of cold fury for Etta. She had continued her trap lines, continued her solitary work, but the injustice of it gnawed at her in quiet moments, in the long hours by her fire when the wind rattled the shutters, and she had nothing to distract her from the memory of Marcus's flat, accusing eyes. She told herself she did not care what he thought of her. She had survived 7 years in that valley without anyone's good opinion, and she would survive whatever remained of her life the same way. But there was a particular sting to being disbelieved by a man whose opinion, despite her every effort to prevent it, had somehow come to matter to her more than she wished to admit. The actual thief, as it happened, was found within the week, though not by Marcus. A drifter named Silas Prine, passing through on his way to the gold camps of Montana, was caught trying to pass one of the stolen silver certificates in a saloon 2 towns over, and the marshal there wired the news back to Larkspur Hollow along with a full confession. Marcus had ridden out to Etta's cabin one more time after that, and she had watched him from her window, half expecting an apology, half dreading the awkwardness of receiving one from a man too proud to easily admit fault. But he had not come to apologize, not properly. He had simply informed her, standing stiffly in her doorway with his hat in his hands, that the real culprit had been found and that he regretted the inconvenience the search had caused her. Inconvenience. As though he had merely tracked mud across her floor rather than accused her, without real evidence, of a crime that could have seen her hanged or imprisoned in a territory where justice for a woman living alone, without family to vouch for her, was a fragile and uncertain thing. "You regret the inconvenience," Etta had repeated, her voice icy. "I did what the evidence suggested," Marcus had said, though there was something in his voice now, some faint crack in the armor of his certainty, that suggested he understood on some level that the words were inadequate. "The evidence," Etta had said, "was the word of a known drunk who has resented me since I refused to sell him pelts on credit 2 winters ago. You did not investigate, Marcus. You assumed. You looked at a woman living alone, without a husband or father to speak for her, and you decided that made her suspect in a way that a man in the same position never would have been." He had not had an answer for that, because there was no honest answer that did not confirm exactly what she had said, and he had left again without another word, and Etta had closed her door and leaned against it and allowed herself, for the first time since the search, to cry, not from sadness exactly, but from the particular exhaustion of being a woman who had to fight twice as hard for half the respect, and who had thought foolishly that Marcus Calloway might have been different from the rest. 3 days after that conversation, the blizzard came. It arrived without the courtesy of much warning, the way the worst mountain storms often did, a wall of gray cloud sweeping down from the peaks in the late morning, the temperature dropping so fast that the water in Etta's rain barrel froze solid within an hour of the first snowflakes. By noon, the wind had risen to a scream, and by early afternoon, visibility had dropped to a few feet in any direction, the world reduced to a howling white chaos that swallowed the mountains, the valley, the very sky itself. Etta, wise in the ways of such storms, had already brought her horse into the small lean-to attached to her cabin, banked her fire high, and settled in to wait out what she suspected would be one of the worst blizzards of her 7 years in that country. She did not think, at first, of Marcus Calloway at all. She had no reason to. He was, so far as she knew, safely in town, perhaps sitting by the stove in the sheriff's office, tending to Wade Harmon in his sickness, entirely unconnected to her own storm-bound solitude. It was 2 days into the blizzard, when the wind had finally begun to slacken enough for the world to become visible again in gray, shifting glimpses, that Etta first heard the news, carried to her by the unlikely messenger of old Whitfield himself, who arrived at her door on snowshoes, half frozen and gasping, having struggled the whole 3 miles from town because, he said, No one else in Larkspur Hollow knew the high trails well enough to search them. And someone needed to know that Deputy Calloway had gone missing. Missing, Etta had repeated, feeling something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. "Rode out 2 days ago," Whitfield had explained, before the worst of it hit, chasing a lead on Prine's partner, some fellow who was supposed to be hiding out in a trapper's shack up near Widow's Pass. "Sheriff Harmon's too sick to do anything about it, and there ain't a man in town with the sense or the skill to go looking in this weather without getting themselves killed too. And you came to me," Etta had said slowly, "because you think I have that sense and that skill." "I know you do," Whitfield had said. "You're the only one who does. I'm sorry for what happened before, with the search and all that business with Bell's lies. Calloway was wrong to do what he did, and I told him so myself. But right now there's a man's life at stake, and pride's got no place in that kind of arithmetic." Etta had stood in her doorway for a long moment, the wind still gusting hard enough to sting her face with ice crystals, and she had thought about the flat coldness of Marcus's eyes when he searched her cabin, the inadequacy of his apology, the fury she had carried in her chest for the better part of a week. And then she had thought about him lying somewhere in that white wilderness, freezing, alone, perhaps already dead, and she had found, to her own surprise, that the fury simply did not matter anymore, not against the weight of a human life. "Give me 20 minutes to gather my gear," she had said, and Whitfield had nodded, relief written plain across his weathered face, and Etta had turned and begun, with the same brisk efficiency she brought to every task in her life, to prepare for a rescue that every instinct told her would be the hardest thing she had ever attempted. She packed with the precision of long practice. Her snowshoes, webbed with rawhide she had strung herself. Her heaviest buffalo robe, the one she reserved for the deepest cold, capable of keeping a body warm even when soaked through, because wool alone would not serve in conditions like these. Extra socks, dry and wrapped in oiled canvas to keep the wet out. A tin of matches sealed in wax. Jerked venison and hardtack enough for 3 days, because she had learned long ago never to venture into the mountains believing a search would be quick. Rope, a full 50 feet of it, because a person lost in deep snow might be found in a ravine, might need hauling up out of a place no horse could reach. Her rifle, though she doubted she would need it for anything but signaling. And her compass, the brass one that had belonged to her father, its needle steady and true even when the world around it seemed to have lost all sense of direction. She also took, without entirely admitting to herself why, a small flask of whiskey and a second buffalo robe, larger than her own, in case the man she found needed more warmth than she alone could provide with her own body. Whitfield had offered to accompany her, but Etta had refused, not out of cruelty but out of plain practicality. He was 61 years old, already half frozen from his walk out to her cabin, and he did not know the high trails the way she did. Taking him would mean slowing her pace to protect a second life, and in weather like this, speed was the difference between finding Marcus alive and finding him too late. "Go back to town," she had told him. "Tell Sheriff Harmon, if he is well enough to hear it, that I am going after his deputy, and tell him I will bring the man back alive if it is within my power to do so." She had set out into the blizzard alone, on snowshoes, following the general direction Whitfield indicated toward Widow's Pass, a route she knew reasonably well from her own trap lines, though she had never attempted it in conditions this severe. The wind had still been fierce, though not the screaming wall it had been at the storm's height, and visibility stretched perhaps 30 feet in the brief lulls between gusts. She moved with the steady, economical pace of a woman who understood that panic and haste killed more people in mountain storms than cold itself. She checked her compass frequently, cross-referencing it against what landmarks she could make out through the swirling snow, and she called Marcus's name periodically, though the wind swallowed her voice almost as quickly as she released it, and she held little hope that any shout of hers would carry far enough to be heard even if he were conscious enough to hear it. The search took the better part of a full day. She found his horse first, or rather, what remained of it, a dark shape half buried near a stand of pines a mile short of Widow's Pass itself, clearly having succumbed to the storm hours earlier, and the sight of it had sent a fresh spike of fear through her chest. Because if the horse had died there, Marcus himself might have gone on foot from that point, in conditions that would have made walking exhausting and treacherous even for a strong man, and there was no way to know which direction he might have taken. She had circled the area methodically, widening her search pattern the way she would when tracking a wounded animal that had gone to ground, reading what disturbances she could find in the snow despite the fresh powder that had fallen and drifted since. It was slow, grinding work, made harder by the failing light as afternoon gave way toward the early winter dusk, and twice she had to stop and force herself to eat. To drink water she melted with heat from a small fire built in the lee of a boulder, because exhaustion was as dangerous an enemy as the cold itself. It was nearly dark, the blue shadows of dusk deepening into the true black of a mountain night, when she finally found the boot protruding from the snow near the base of a lodgepole pine, a quarter-mile from where the horse had died, in a spot that suggested Marcus had tried to seek shelter against the tree's trunk when he could go no further. And that was how the story had begun, with Etta Lockhart on her knees in the fading light, digging a half-frozen deputy out of a snowbank with her bare hands, fighting against a blizzard and against death itself for the life of a man who had wronged her, because, whatever fury she carried in her heart, it had never once outweighed her sense of what was right. Now, with his face cleared and that faint fog of breath confirming he still lived, Etta worked with a speed and precision that pushed aside every other consideration. She dug his shoulders free, then his other leg, rolling him as gently as the urgency allowed onto the larger buffalo robe she had spread beside him. His body was rigid with cold, his skin at his exposed wrists and neck an alarming shade of gray-white that she recognized, with grim clarity as the early signs of severe frostbite. "Marcus," she said, close to his ear, her voice sharp with command rather than gentleness, because gentleness would not wake him and she needed him at least partially conscious for what came next. "Marcus Calloway, you open your eyes right now." His eyelids fluttered, the frost on his lashes cracking slightly, and a low, barely audible groan escaped his chapped lips. "That is right," Etta said. "You are not dying in my snow. I did not haul myself 3 miles through a blizzard to bury you out here. You are going to help me, even if it is only enough to keep your own blood moving. Do you understand me?" She could not build a proper shelter here, not with darkness falling and the temperature continuing its brutal drop, but she had passed a rock outcropping 100 yards back that offered a natural overhang, enough to break the worst of the wind, and she made the decision quickly, the way she made all her decisions in the wilderness, without second-guessing herself once the choice was made. Moving Marcus was its own battle. He was a big man, well over 6 feet and solid with the muscle of a life spent in physical work, and even half-conscious, he was a dead weight that tested every ounce of strength Etta possessed. She could not carry him, not the full 100 yards, but she found that if she wrapped the buffalo robe around him and used it as a makeshift sled, dragging it by the corners she had reinforced with rope, she could move him in stages, resting between each pull to catch her breath and check that he still breathed. By the time she reached the rock overhang, her arms trembled with exhaustion and her own body had begun to protest the cold in ways that frightened her, a warning she recognized from years of experience that she was pushing dangerously close to her own limits. But she did not stop, not yet, because Marcus's need was greater than her exhaustion, and she had learned long ago that the wilderness did not grant second chances to those who yielded to their own fatigue before the work was finished. She built her fire with the efficient speed of a woman who had done it 1,000 times in worse conditions, using dry tinder she had carried sealed against the wet, feeding it carefully into flame despite fingers that had gone stiff and clumsy with cold. The overhang trapped enough of the heat, reflected it back against the rock face, that within 20 minutes She had a fire substantial enough to begin the desperate work of warming a half-frozen man back from the edge of death. She stripped his outer coat, wet through and useless, replacing it with the dry buffalo robe. She checked his hands and feet for the telltale waxy whiteness of frostbite, finding it present but not yet at the stage where flesh would be lost, a small mercy in an otherwise dire situation. She rubbed warmth back into his fingers with her own hands, careful not to rub too hard, knowing that frostbitten flesh could be further damaged by rough treatment. And she pressed her own body against his beneath the robe, sharing what warmth she had left, because in cases of severe hypothermia, she knew, sometimes the only cure that worked fast enough was another living body's heat. It was in this position, pressed against Marcus Calloway's chest in the flickering firelight of a rock overhang while a blizzard howled beyond their shelter, that Etta first felt his eyes open fully and focus, however weakly, on her face. "Etta," he said, his voice a broken rasp, barely more than a whisper, "you should not be here. And you should not have gone chasing outlaws in a blizzard without the sense to turn back when the sky told you plainly what was coming." Etta replied, though there was no real anger in it now, only the fierce relief of a woman who had feared, more than she wanted to admit, that she would find only a corpse. "How?" he managed, his teeth chattering so violently the word came out in fragments. "Did you find me?" "I tracked you," Etta said simply. "The same way I track any creature that has gone to ground in a storm. Your horse died a quarter-mile back. I found where you tried to walk on, found the places where your steps grew shorter and more uneven as the cold took hold of you, and I followed that trail to where you had stopped fighting it and sat down against that pine to wait for death." Marcus stared at her, and even in his weakened state, even with his body still shaking with cold and his face still gray with the aftermath of near-fatal exposure, something in his expression shifted, something that had nothing to do with the fever of hypothermia and everything to do with a dawning, humbled amazement. "You tracked me," he said again, as though testing the words, "through a blizzard, alone." "I did. No search party, no men from town." "There were no men from town willing or able to do it," Etta said. "Whitfield came to me because he knew, and I think you know too, that I am the only person in this valley with the skill to find a man lost in weather like this." Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again there were tears at the corners, though whether from the cold or from something deeper Etta could not say for certain. "I accused you of theft," he said. "I searched your home. I treated you like a criminal without proof, without even the decency of asking you plainly what happened before I rode out with my mind already made up." "You did," Etta agreed, her voice level, "and you still came for me." "I did," she said again. "Because, whatever fool thing you did to me, Marcus Calloway, I was not about to let a man freeze to death in these mountains when I had the power to prevent it. That is not about you. That is about who I choose to be." He was quiet for a long moment, the fire crackling between them, the wind still howling beyond the shelter of the overhang, and when he spoke again his voice had steadied slightly, though it remained rough with cold and exhaustion. "I have never," he said slowly, "in my life met anyone who could do what you just did. Not a man, not a woman, not one of the old trappers who have worked these mountains since before I was born. You found me in a blizzard that killed my horse and would have killed most any man twice as strong as I am. And you did it alone, without help, without hesitation." "I did what needed doing," Etta said, though something in his words had reached a place in her chest she had thought closed off, guarded, and she found herself, despite every intention to remain composed, blinking back an unexpected sting of tears of her own. "No," Marcus said, "it is more than that. I looked at you all this time and I saw a woman living alone in the mountains, and some fool part of me thought that made you vulnerable, made you someone who might have needed to steal, might have needed protecting or suspecting. I could not have been more wrong. You are not vulnerable, Etta Lockhart. You are the strongest, most capable person I have ever known, and I was a blind fool not to see it before now." Etta did not answer immediately, too overwhelmed by the rawness of the moment, by the storm still raging outside and the fragile miracle of the man breathing, alive in her arms. Instead, she busied herself checking the fire, adjusting the robe around his shoulders, doing the practical things that kept her hands occupied while her heart worked through the tangle of feelings his words had stirred. "You need to sleep," she said finally. "Your body has been through more than most survive. I will keep the fire fed through the night. Do not fight me on this, Marcus. Not tonight." He did not fight her. He was too exhausted, too thoroughly wrung out by his ordeal, and within minutes his breathing had evened into the deep, slow rhythm of true sleep, his body finally beginning to release the tension of hours spent fighting for survival against a storm that had very nearly claimed him. Etta stayed awake through that long, dangerous night, feeding the fire in careful increments, checking Marcus's pulse and breathing at regular intervals the way she had learned to monitor injured animals caught in her traps, watching for any sign that his condition might worsen despite her efforts. The wind howled and shrieked beyond their small shelter, snow drifting in occasional flurries even under the overhang's protection, and Etta found herself, in the long hours of that vigil, thinking not of the accusation and the search and the fury she had carried for a week, but of the way Marcus's eyes had looked at her in the firelight, full of a shocked and humbled respect that no man in Larkspur Hollow had ever shown her before. She had spent 7 years being underestimated, dismissed, treated as an oddity or a scandal by a town that did not know what to do with a woman who lived by her own skill rather than by attachment to a husband or father. She had grown accustomed to that treatment, had built walls against it thick enough that she rarely felt the sting of it anymore. But something about the particular quality of Marcus's amazement, the genuine humility in his recognition of her competence, had slipped past those walls in a way she had not anticipated and was not entirely certain how to feel about. Dawn came slowly, gray light seeping into the world as the blizzard, at last, began to lose its terrible strength, the wind dropping from a scream to a mournful moan, and finally, by mid-morning, to something almost like calm. Etta checked Marcus's color, found it improved, the gray pallor giving way to something closer to his natural complexion, and when he woke, his eyes were clearer, his voice steadier, though he was still weak enough that she knew moving him would need to be done with great care. "How do you feel?" she asked, offering him a strip of jerked venison and a cup of water she had melted and warmed over the fire. "Like I was run over by a freight wagon," Marcus admitted, managing a faint, exhausted smile that was the first she had ever seen from him that held no trace of guardedness or authority, only genuine, unshielded gratitude. "But alive, because of you." "We are not out of danger yet," Etta said, refusing to let herself dwell too long on the warmth that smile stirred in her chest. "Your feet took the worst of the frostbite. We need to get you to shelter with proper warmth and soon, or you risk losing toes even if you have already survived the worst of the cold." "Where," Marcus asked, "do you propose we go, given that my horse is dead and I doubt I have the strength to walk far?" "My cabin is closer than town," Etta said. 3 miles, but through terrain I know better than any trail back toward Larkspur Hollow. I will not lie to you. It will be hard on you, but it is our best chance." Marcus nodded, and though the effort of standing, even with Etta's support, clearly cost him dearly, he did not complain, did not protest, simply gritted his teeth against the pain in his frostbitten feet and let her guide him, step by agonizing step, out from beneath the rock overhang and into the pale, storm-scoured light of the mountain morning. The journey back to Etta's cabin took the better part of the day, far longer than it would have taken her alone, but she paced their progress carefully, insisting on frequent rests, monitoring Marcus's condition with the same vigilance she had maintained through the night, and by the time they finally reached the familiar site of her cabin nestled against Bitter Creek, both of them were exhausted nearly past the point of coherent thought, but Marcus was alive and improving. And that was the only measure of success that mattered. She settled him near her fire, stripped his boots to examine his feet properly in better light, and felt a wave of relief at finding the frostbite, while severe, had not progressed to the point of requiring amputation of any toes, provided he kept off them and allowed proper healing over the coming weeks. She made a poultice of the kind she had learned from an old Shoshone woman who had once traded with her father, a mixture of yarrow and warm animal fat that helped ease the pain and promote healing in frost-damaged flesh, and she wrapped his feet carefully, her hands steady and sure despite the exhaustion that made her own body ache in every joint. "You have done this before," Marcus observed, watching her work with an expression that had settled over the course of that long day's journey into something quieter than shock but no less admiring. "I have treated my own frostbite twice," Etta said, "and helped 2 other trappers through worse than what you have suffered. It is a common enough danger in this line of work." "I am beginning to understand," Marcus said slowly, "that there is a great deal about your line of work, and about you, that I never bothered to learn because I assumed I already knew what kind of person you were." "And what kind of person did you assume I was?" Etta asked, unable to keep a slight edge from her voice despite everything that had passed between them in the last day. "A woman who had chosen a hard, lonely life because circumstance forced her into it," Marcus admitted. "I never once considered that you might have chosen it because you were simply better suited to it than most men I have ever known, that you found in it something that fulfilled you rather than something that merely sustained you." Etta was quiet for a long moment, tying off the last of the bandage around his feet, and when she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its edge, replaced by something more contemplative. "I did choose it," she said. "After my father died, people expected me to find a husband quickly, to attach myself to some man in town who would provide for me and give me respectability. I could have done that. There were men who offered, but I had learned to trap and hunt at my father's side since I was 12 years old, back in Missouri, and I found in that work a kind of freedom I was not willing to trade away for the sake of respectability. I like depending on my own skill, my own judgment. I like knowing that whatever I have, I earned through my own hands and my own mind. That," Marcus said quietly, "is the most admirable thing I have ever heard a person say about their own life." Etta looked up at him then, meeting his eyes fully for the first time since they had returned to the cabin, and found in his expression none of the wariness or judgment that had characterized their previous encounters, only a genuine, searching warmth that made her breath catch unexpectedly in her throat. "You are still recovering," she said, needing to break the intensity of the moment. "You should rest. I will prepare something to eat." Over the following days, as the blizzard's aftermath settled into the ordinary hard cold of a Wyoming winter and Marcus's body slowly healed under Etta's careful attention, something began to shift between them, something neither of them had expected, and both of them, in their separate ways, found themselves reluctant to name too soon. Marcus, confined to Etta's cabin by his healing feet, had ample time to observe the rhythms of her daily life, and what he saw only deepened the shocked respect that had first taken root in him during that desperate night beneath the rock overhang. He watched her check her trap lines each morning, venturing out into the cold with a competence that made the work look almost effortless despite the genuine skill and physical endurance it required. He watched her skin and stretch pelts with a precision that spoke of years of practiced expertise, her hands moving with an economy of motion that wasted no effort and produced results of a quality he had never seen matched, even by the most experienced male trappers he had known. He watched her repair a section of her cabin's roof that had been damaged by the storm's weight of snow, climbing up with tools she had made herself, working with the calm confidence of someone entirely secure in her own capabilities. He watched her butcher a deer she brought back from one afternoon's hunt, working quickly and cleanly, wasting nothing, preserving the meat and the hide with methods that reflected a deep, practical knowledge of survival in that unforgiving country. And through all of it, Marcus found himself falling, slowly and then with increasing certainty, into a feeling he had not expected and was not entirely sure how to process, given the shameful way their relationship had begun. "I owe you an apology," he said one evening, nearly a week into his recovery, as they sat together near the fire while snow fell softly outside, a gentler snow now, nothing like the fury of the blizzard that had nearly claimed his life. "A real one, not the half-hearted thing I offered you before, about the search of your cabin." "You do," Etta agreed, not softening the truth of it even now, even with the warmth that had grown between them over the preceding days. "I was wrong," Marcus said. "Not just wrong about the theft, though I was wrong about that too. I was wrong about you. From the very first day I rode out here and looked down at you from my horse like I had some right to judge you before I even knew you. I let Cyrus Bell's word carry more weight than it should have because it was easier than admitting that a woman living alone, without the protection of a husband, might simply be exactly what she claimed to be: honest, capable, and deserving of the same presumption of innocence I would have extended to any man in this valley." "Why?" Etta asked quietly. "Are you telling me this now?" "Because you saved my life," Marcus said, "at considerable risk to your own, after I had done nothing to earn that kind of loyalty from you. And because somewhere in these last days, watching you work, watching you live your life with more competence and more grace than I have seen in any person, man or woman, I have come to understand that the accusation I made against you was not just wrong as a matter of evidence. It was a betrayal of everything I should have already known about your character, if I had bothered to truly see you, instead of seeing only what my own prejudices expected to find." Etta felt something loosen in her chest, some tightly held knot of hurt that had lingered since that terrible day of the search, and she found herself, without entirely deciding to, reaching across the small distance between them to take Marcus's hand in hers. "I forgive you," she said. "Not because you deserve it easily, but because I have watched you these last days too, Marcus Calloway, and I have seen a man willing to admit his own faults, willing to change his mind when the evidence of his own eyes contradicted what he had assumed. That is rarer than you might think, in a man or in anyone." Marcus's hand tightened around hers, and in the firelight his eyes held an intensity that made Etta's heart quicken despite her every intention of remaining guarded. "I think," he said slowly, "that I have fallen in love with you, Etta Lockhart. I do not say that lightly, and I do not say it because you saved my life, though that is certainly part of what opened my eyes. I say it because I have never in my life met a person of such strength, such fierce intelligence, such complete and unapologetic capability, and I find that I do not want to spend another day of my life without you in it." Etta was quiet for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of the flattery or presumption she had learned to distrust in men who thought a declaration of love entitled them to something in return. But she found none of that in Marcus's expression, only an honest, searching vulnerability that mirrored, she realized with some surprise, the very feelings that had been growing in her own chest since that first desperate night in the storm. "I have spent 7 years," she said, "building a life that depends on no one but myself. I am not sure I know how to let someone else matter as much as you seem to be asking me to let you matter." "I am not asking you to depend on me," Marcus said. "I would not want that, even if you offered it. I have watched you these last days, and the last thing I want is to diminish anything about who you are or what you have built. I am asking only if there might be room, in the life you have made for yourself, for a man who has come to admire you more than he has ever admired anyone, and who would spend the rest of his days trying to be worthy of that admiration." Etta felt tears rise in her eyes, unexpected and unbidden, and she did not try to hide them, because something about the honesty of the moment made pretense feel impossible. "I think," she said, echoing his own earlier words, "that I have fallen in love with you too, Marcus Calloway, against every sensible instinct I possess, and despite the terrible way you first treated me. I do not know what that means for either of us, given how differently we have each built our lives. But I find that I do not want to spend another day without knowing what it might mean either. What followed, in the weeks after that fireside confession, was a courtship unlike any Etta had imagined for herself, built not on the traditional exchanges of a town social or a church gathering, but on the shared work of survival and mutual respect that had first drawn them together in the crucible of the blizzard. Marcus's feet healed enough by late February for him to return to his duties in Larkspur Hollow, though Sheriff Harmon, recovering slowly from his pneumonia, insisted Marcus take on lighter tasks for another month to ensure the frostbite had not left lasting damage. During that time, Marcus made the 3-mile ride out to Etta's cabin nearly every day that weather permitted, and their conversations, which had begun as halting, uncertain things born of gratitude and shock, deepened over those weeks into something Etta had never experienced before. A genuine partnership of minds, in which Marcus asked her opinion on matters of law enforcement in the valley, on the character of men he was investigating, on the practical realities of survival that his town-bound upbringing had never taught him, and in which Etta found herself, for the first time in her adult life, sharing her thoughts freely with someone who received them not as presumption but as valuable insight. She taught him, over those weeks, some of the skills she had spent years perfecting: how to read the subtle signs of weather change in the behavior of birds and the quality of light on distant peaks, how to set and check a trap line efficiently, though he made it clear, with a wry humor that increasingly characterized their interactions, that he had no intention of abandoning law enforcement for trapping. How to track a person or an animal through snow, reading the depth and spacing of footprints to determine speed, injury, or exhaustion. "You would have made a formidable tracker for the sheriff's office," Marcus told her one afternoon, as she demonstrated how to identify the difference between a deer's trail and a fleeing man's footprints in fresh snow. "I have half a mind to ask Sheriff Harmon if there is some official capacity in which the town might benefit from your skills." "I do not need an official capacity," Etta said, though she could not keep the pleased flush from her cheeks at the suggestion. "I have managed well enough without one." "I know you have," Marcus said. "I am not suggesting you need it. I am suggesting that this town has been foolish not to recognize and make use of the finest tracker and survivalist in the entire valley, simply because she happens to wear skirts on the rare occasions she comes to town." That conversation, as it happened, was not merely idle talk. Within a month, Sheriff Harmon, recovered enough to resume his duties though still weakened by his long illness, formally approached Etta with a proposal that she serve, on an as-needed basis, as a tracker and search consultant for the sheriff's office, to be called upon whenever a person went missing in the mountains or a criminal fled into terrain that required her particular expertise to navigate. The position came with modest pay, but more importantly, it came with an official recognition of her skill that no amount of private admiration from individual townsfolk had ever offered her before. Etta accepted, and in doing so, found herself drawn more frequently into the orbit of Larkspur Hollow's daily life, working alongside Marcus on cases that ranged from tracking a horse thief through the foothills to locating a lost child who had wandered from a homestead during a spring thaw and nearly drowned in the swollen creek before Etta's tracking led the search party to her in time. Each case, each shared success, deepened the bond between Etta and Marcus, and by the time the last of the winter snow had melted into the rushing creeks of a Wyoming spring, their courtship had progressed into something neither of them any longer tried to disguise or deny, even to the more conservative elements of Larkspur Hollow's population who still, in some cases, clung to their doubts about a woman who lived as independently as Etta Lockhart did. There were, of course, those in town who disapproved, who whispered that Deputy Calloway could do better than a woman who wore trousers and skinned animals for a living, who suggested that his affection for her was some temporary madness brought on by the trauma of nearly dying in the blizzard. Etta heard these whispers occasionally when she came into town for supplies, and while they no longer had the power to wound her the way similar comments might have years earlier, she found herself grateful in those moments for the fierce and unwavering way Marcus defended her, publicly and without hesitation, whenever such comments reached his ears. "I have never known a person of greater strength or character than Etta Lockhart," he told Cyrus Bell directly, in the middle of the Larkspur Hollow saloon, when that same man who had once falsely placed her near the assay office made some snide remark about her unconventional life. "And I would remind you, Bell, that it was her lie about seeing Miss Lockhart that led me to make one of the greatest mistakes of my career, accusing an innocent woman of theft. If anyone in this town has character worth questioning, it is you, not her." Bell had slunk away without further comment, and word of the confrontation had spread through Larkspur Hollow with the particular speed that gossip always traveled in a small town. And Etta, when she heard the story second-hand from Whitfield's wife at the Mercantile, had felt something warm and unfamiliar bloom in her chest at the knowledge that Marcus had defended her honor so publicly and so completely. By midsummer, Marcus had begun speaking, in careful and tentative terms at first, of a future together, though he was careful in every conversation to frame that future in terms that honored the independence Etta had fought so hard to build for herself. "I would not ask you to give up your cabin," he said one evening in July, as they sat together on the porch of that same cabin, watching the long summer twilight settle golden over the mountains. "I would not ask you to give up your trap lines or your work for the sheriff's office or any part of the life you have built. I only want to be part of that life, in whatever way makes sense to both of us." "What are you suggesting?" Etta asked, though she suspected, from the careful way he had approached the subject, exactly what he meant to say. "I am suggesting," Marcus said, taking her hand in his, "that I would like to marry you, Etta Lockhart, and that I would be honored to make my home here, at your cabin, or wherever you wish to live, working alongside you in whatever way our two lives can best be combined. I know that is not the traditional way such things are usually arranged, with the man expecting the woman to move into whatever home he provides. But I have never known you to be a traditional woman, and I would not insult you by pretending our marriage should be a traditional one." Etta felt tears rise, unbidden, in her eyes for the second time in their acquaintance, and this time she did not try to hide them at all. "You are certain," she said, "that you want this? A wife who will continue to trap and hunt and track, who will not spend her days keeping house in the manner most men expect, who has opinions of her own that she will not hesitate to share even when they contradict yours." "I am more certain of that," Marcus said, "than I have been of anything in my entire life. I fell in love with you, Etta, precisely because you are not the kind of woman who would fit neatly into anyone else's expectations. I do not want a different version of you. I want exactly the woman who dug me out of a snowbank with her bare hands, and then had the audacity to scold me for nearly dying." Etta laughed then, a real, unguarded laugh that surprised her with its lightness, and she leaned forward and kissed him, there on the porch of the cabin she had built with her own hands, in the golden light of a Wyoming summer evening, and felt, for the first time in 7 years of careful, guarded solitude, that she was not diminishing herself by allowing another person into her life, but rather expanding into something larger and richer than she had ever imagined possible. "Yes," she said, when the kiss finally ended. "Yes, Marcus Calloway, I will marry you, on the condition that you understand exactly what you are agreeing to." "I understand," Marcus said, smiling with a warmth that had become, over the preceding months, entirely familiar and entirely precious to her. "I am agreeing to spend the rest of my life married to the finest tracker, the most capable trapper, and the strongest, most remarkable woman in the entire territory of Wyoming. I consider myself the luckiest man alive." They were married in September of 1887, in a small ceremony held in the yard of Etta's cabin rather than in the Larkspur Hollow church, a choice that reflected both their preferences and served as a quiet declaration that their union would be built on their own terms rather than the town's expectations. Sheriff Harmon, fully recovered from his illness by then, stood as witness alongside Whitfield and his wife, and even Cyrus Bell, in a gesture that surprised everyone including himself, sent a small gift of tobacco and a note of grudging congratulations, perhaps the closest thing to an apology the man was capable of offering. Etta wore a simple dress of blue wool, practical enough to satisfy her own sensibilities while still marking the significance of the occasion, and Marcus wore his best coat, though he had left his badge pinned to his chest even for the ceremony, a small joke between them about the unlikely circumstances that had first brought them together. "I believe this is the first wedding I have ever attended where the bride threatened, during her vows, to leave the groom in a snowbank if he ever again assumed the worst of her without evidence," Whitfield's wife remarked afterward, laughing, and Etta had laughed too, because it was, in fact, precisely the vow she had made, half in jest and half in deadly earnest, and Marcus had accepted it with the same humbled respect that had characterized his feelings for her since that first terrible, wonderful night in the blizzard. Their life together, in the years that followed, was neither easy nor without its own challenges, but it was built on a foundation that neither of them had any doubt would hold against whatever hardship the frontier chose to throw at them. Marcus continued his work as deputy, and eventually, when Sheriff Harmon finally retired in 1891, Marcus was elected to take his place, a position he held with a fairness and thoroughness that reflected, in no small part, the lesson he had learned so painfully and so thoroughly in his treatment of Etta all those years before. He never again let assumption or prejudice guide an investigation, and Larkspur Hollow, under his tenure as sheriff, became known throughout the territory as a town where justice was administered with unusual care and diligence. Etta continued her work as well, her trap lines and her consultant position with the sheriff's office both growing over the years as her reputation for skill and reliability spread beyond the immediate valley. She trained, eventually, 2 younger women from town who had shown interest in learning the trapping trade, passing along not just the practical skills, but the fierce, unapologetic confidence that had allowed her to build such an independent life for herself. And both of those women went on to establish their own successful trap lines, a small but meaningful expansion of the opportunities available to women in that rugged country. In the spring of 1889, Etta gave birth to their first child, a son they named Thomas, after Marcus's father, and Etta, true to the promise she had made to herself long before she ever met Marcus, continued her trapping work through her pregnancy right up until the final weeks, and returned to it within 2 months of Thomas's birth, carrying him in a specially designed pack she constructed herself when necessary, though more often relying on the help of Whitfield's wife, who had grown fond enough of Etta over the years to offer regular assistance with childcare on the days her trap lines demanded her full attention. 2 years later, in 1891, they welcomed a daughter, whom they named Sarah, after Etta's own mother, who had died when Etta was still a child in Missouri, and by the time both children were old enough to accompany their mother into the mountains, Etta found herself teaching them, just as her own father had once taught her, the intricate skills of reading the land, tracking animals, and surviving in a wilderness that demanded respect, but rewarded knowledge and preparation with a kind of freedom few people ever experienced in their lives. Marcus, for his part, never lost the sense of humbled admiration that had first bloomed in him during that desperate night beneath the rock overhang, watching his wife's competence with a wonder that, if anything, only deepened as the years passed and he witnessed the full breadth of her capabilities. Not just her skill with traps and tracking, but her fierce intelligence in matters of business, her careful management of their combined finances that ensured their family's security even through lean years, her wisdom in matters of community dispute that she was increasingly called upon to help mediate, given the reputation for fairness and clear thinking she had built throughout the valley. "I think," Marcus told her once, on the evening of their 5th wedding anniversary, as they sat together on the porch of the larger home they had built adjoining her original cabin, watching their 2 children play in the yard as the sun set gold over the mountains, "that I fell more deeply in love with you with each passing year, rather than less, which I understand is not always how these things go for other couples. That is because you continue to be surprised by me," Etta said, smiling. "Even after all this time." "I hope I always am," Marcus said. "I hope I never take for granted exactly how remarkable a woman I married. I think of that first night often, you know. Digging me out of that snowbank. I think of how close I came to dying, and how the only reason I did not was because you refused to let your own anger at me outweigh your fundamental sense of what was right. I do not know many people, man or woman, capable of that kind of moral clarity in the moment it actually matters." "You would have done the same for me," Etta said. "I have never doubted that, not since I came to know your character properly." "I hope I would have," Marcus said. "But I am not certain I would have had the skill to succeed, even if I had possessed the will. That is the difference between us, Etta. You had both." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the children, listening to the evening sounds of the valley they had both come to call home, and Etta found herself, in that quiet moment, reflecting on the long and winding path that had brought her to this particular happiness. The loss of her father, the years of solitary independence, the injustice of Marcus's false accusation, the desperate rescue in the blizzard that had nearly cost him his life, and had instead given both of them a future neither had thought to hope for. She thought, too, of the particular injustice she had faced simply for being a woman who chose to live and work outside the narrow expectations her society held for her, and she felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that her example, and the position she had carved out for herself in Larkspur Hollow's official life, had opened doors for other women in that valley who might otherwise have been dismissed or underestimated the same way she once had been. The blizzard of 1887 remained, in the years that followed, a story told and retold throughout Larkspur Hollow, sometimes exaggerated in the telling, as such stories often are, but always centered on the same essential truth: that Etta Lockhart, trapper woman, had walked alone into one of the worst storms the valley had ever seen, and had brought back, against all reasonable expectation, a half-frozen deputy who would have certainly died without her particular skill and her particular courage. It became, over time, something of a local legend, told to newcomers as an illustration of both the dangers of that mountain country and the remarkable capabilities of the woman who had made her home there. And Etta, when she heard the story told by others, always felt a complicated mixture of pride and humility, knowing that the true heart of the story was not really about heroics at all, but about the slow, difficult work of 2 people learning to see each other clearly, past their own assumptions and prejudices, to the genuine character that lay beneath. Marcus Calloway served as sheriff of Larkspur Hollow for over 20 years, a tenure marked by fairness, careful investigation, and a deep respect for the particular skills and knowledge that different members of his community brought to the difficult work of maintaining order in a rugged frontier territory. He never again made the mistake of assuming guilt before gathering proper evidence, and he often told newer deputies, when training them in the proper conduct of investigations, the story of how his own worst professional failure had also led him, through circumstances he could never have predicted, to the greatest happiness of his life. Etta Lockhart continued her trapping and tracking work well into her later years, her reputation growing beyond the borders of the valley, until trappers and lawmen from as far as Cheyenne and even Denver occasionally sought her expertise for particularly difficult searches or particularly challenging terrain. She trained not only her own children, but eventually grandchildren in the skills her own father had taught her, ensuring that the particular knowledge and independence she had cultivated over a lifetime would not be lost, but would instead continue, passed down through generations of a family built on mutual respect and genuine partnership. Their marriage, in the end, became something of a model for what a union between equally capable, equally respected partners could look like, in a time and place where such equality was rare and often actively discouraged. Etta never gave up her independence, never allowed herself to be diminished into merely a sheriff's wife, rather than the accomplished woman she had always been, and Marcus never expected her to, understanding, from that first shocking night in the blizzard onward, exactly what kind of remarkable person he had been fortunate enough to love and to marry. On the evening of what would have been their 30th wedding anniversary, in 1917, with their children grown and their own grandchildren beginning to explore the mountains under Etta's careful instruction, Marcus, his hair now gray but his eyes still holding the same warm admiration they had held since that long-ago winter, took his wife's weathered, capable hands in his own and spoke words that echoed, in their essential truth, everything that had passed between them across their long and remarkable life together. "I have loved you," he said, "since the moment I opened my eyes in that blizzard and saw you fighting to keep me alive, angry at me still, and yet refusing to let that anger outweigh what was right. I have loved you through every year since, watching you build a life, and then a family, and then a legacy, entirely through the strength of your own hands and your own mind. I do not know what I did in my life to deserve a partner such as you, but I have spent 30 years trying to be worthy of the woman who dug me out of the snow, and I intend to spend whatever years remain to me continuing that same effort." Etta, her own eyes bright with tears that came easily now, in the tender years of a long and fulfilling life, leaned forward and kissed her husband with all the accumulated love of 3 decades shared together. "You have been worthy of me," she said, "every single day, Marcus Calloway, not because you ever needed to prove yourself to me, but because you learned, truly learned, what it means to see a person clearly, without the fog of assumption or prejudice clouding your vision. That is the rarest gift one person can offer another, and you have offered it to me every day of our life together." They remained together, deeply and completely in love, for the rest of their long lives, their story of blizzard and rescue, of accusation and forgiveness, of fierce independence meeting humbled respect, becoming a permanent part of the history of Larkspur Hollow, told and retold to each new generation as proof that even the coldest, most desperate circumstances could give rise to the warmest, most enduring love, provided 2 people were willing to see each other, finally and fully, for exactly who they truly were. And so it was that the sheriff's deputy who vanished during a blizzard, frozen nearly to death in the merciless grip of a Wyoming winter, was found alive by the one person in the entire valley skilled and determined enough to bring him back from the very edge of death, and in being saved, found not only his life restored but a love that would define and enrich every remaining year of his existence, a love built not on rescue alone, but on the deeper, more lasting foundation of 2 remarkable people finally, truly seeing each other for who they were.